is Dr. Jeff VanWormer, who is a behavioral epidemiologist with research interests in the primary prevention of cardiometabolic disease, community risk factor surveillance, and lifestyle interventions. He currently serves as a research scientist in the Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health at Marshfield, and is also the interim director of the Center for Oral and Systemic Health. He has undertaken several evidence-based medicine and health disparities projects focused on obesity, medication use, oral hygiene, and vaccinations, among others. He's also an investigator member of the National Healthcare Systems Research Network. And Jeff, we'd love to hear more about that too, if there's time. And the University of Wisconsin's Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, which is the sponsor for this program today. So thank you very much, Jeff. Really appreciate your presence today, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Asia, for the kind introduction. I realize I'm out of date on one thing. I am actually no longer the interim director of the Center for Oral and Systemic Health. That shop is run by Raja Nagarajan now, so I can't claim any credit there. But I was going to talk a little bit today about clinical trials research in Marshfield. I don't know, are my slides up?
Your slides are up. We can see them.
Oh, as well. I'm an epidemiologist by training. Home is in our Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health. And I'll talk a little bit about Marshfield first, but I should probably start by saying I'm not a trialist. I do some trials and have done more lately, but there are certainly many others in Marshfield who can speak a little bit more eloquently to the broad landscape there, but I'll do my best. If we go on to the next slide. Okay, just a quick overview. Most of the folks are somewhat familiar with Marshfield, but just a quick by the numbers here. We are located in the north central part of the state with about 1,200 docs that cover over 50 centers, and most of those are medical clinics, some are dental centers, and we have 11 hospitals as well. We serve about 300,000 patients annually, and we also have our health insurance provider in this area. So on the map here, you can kind of see our geographic spread. And this really covers the more sparsely populated areas of Wisconsin, as you might imagine. Next slide, please. So the Research Institute is actually the research arm of the health system. We were founded in 1959, and we're not a huge shop, but for this part of the world, I suppose we do a fair bit of science. And so we have over 30 full-time investigators, and then about 150 of our clinicians are affiliated somehow with the Research Institute, usually meaning that they do research part-time, and there are 200 staff. We bring in about 35 million in external funding in a given year, publish a couple hundred papers, and we are part of several national research consortiums, including some with the University of Wisconsin. I'll talk a little bit more about those as I get into the rest of my spiel. Next slide, please. So this isn't particularly relevant, but there are on the wings of this slide, you can see this is the organization or how we're structured in our research institute. But on the wings here, you can see our 6 centers. And going down from the left, we have our Cancer Care and Research Center, our Clinical Research Center, our Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health, where I am, our Center for Precision Medicine Research, Oral and Systemic Health, and the National PharmD Center, where Casper is housed, and he'll talk a little bit more about today. The top 2 on the left is really where most of the action happens in clinical trials, in our Cancer Research Center and our Clinical Research Center. But the truth is all of our centers do trials to some degree. Next slide, please. In terms of the landscape, the Research Institute has about 800 open studies in a given year, and nearly half of those are indeed clinical trials. Now, at any given moment in time, not all are active or recruiting. Right now, it looks like we've got about 195 clinical trials that are open and enrolling. Most of those, as I imagine is the case in many healthcare systems, most of those are dominated by oncology. This is where a lot of the phase 2 and phase 3 pharma trials occur. Some device trials in cardiovascular medicine, but most of these are coordinated some way, somehow through those two centers I mentioned, the Cancer Care and Research Center or the Clinical Research Center. Now, those two shops are run by Dr. Adedayo Anatillo and Bob Hawes, respectively, and those folks couldn't make it today. And so I won't try to dive into too many details on what all those trials are, but would certainly encourage this group to stay in touch with those two medical directors of those institutions, as they're really doing much of the heavy lifting with the volume of trials in our institution. But there are also some burgeoning areas where we're doing more or newer trials in. Some of this is in laboratory sciences. The Marshfield is the core lab essentially for the CDC in COVID studies. Many of those are trials. So a lot of the COVID samples around the country that are used for research actually come through Marshfield for that. We also are broaching into some newer areas around compassionate care trials, end-of-life care, things in that space. And then maybe most recently in some of these large pragmatic trials. And this is where I have most of my clinical trials experience. So I'll talk in a little bit more detail about that if we can move on to the next slide. So the pragmatic trial approach, some have heard of, some haven't. It's not necessarily a new idea, but it comes out of some of the gripes really that in the clinical trial space of late. And this was a review done by Rob Califf, I think before he was at FDA, just looking at a probe of trials on that are registered by the government some years back. And as you might imagine, most of these are rather small trials. The budgets were rigorous in most cases, but they left some methodological things to be desired too. A lot of surrogate endpoints. Some trials did a lot of adjudication of outcomes, some not so much. But most of these were dominant in the research setting. And so I think it's probably fair to say that the data was, high grade, high validity, a lot of auditing, monitoring, et cetera. But in some ways that creates some issues for the future. We can move on to the next slide. And I'll just throw one example here. This is well known to folks in cardiovascular research, called the Improve It trial. My information on this slide, which might be in a forward click, but the Improvement trial was designed to look at it. It was a statin trial, statin and niacin. Statin's well known for our cardiologists and our primary care docs to prevent heart attacks and strokes. If you lower LDL cholesterol down to about 70, you do get some additional benefit in terms of avoiding those cardiovascular disease outcomes. And so one question was, if you add this drug from Merck called ezetimibe, do you get additional benefit? Great big study, lots of heap of effort, 10 years worth of work, lots of investigator meetings, lots of adjudication of events. At the end of the day, the answer to that question was yes, you do get some benefit by adding ezetimibe to statin therapy for the low price of about $400 million to complete that trial. And so some have kind of looked at this landscape and said perhaps there are some price that we're paying for this in the national landscape, in that it has become very expensive and increasingly complex to do trials. Next slide, please. And so some of that business some of that investment is starting to move out. This was a study in 2014, just looking at growth in research R&D. Clearly see that in Europe and the United States, not a lot of growth during the time frame they were looking at, and most of that
Jeff,
is
sorry to
due
interrupt you. We're getting a little audio
age
issues from you. Not sure if there's anything that can be done. But,
where it's a little bit larger trials. And so that's next slide. I'll try to get a little bit closer here.
yeah, we can't really hear you at all.
This is Brian.
Next slide.
Jeff, maybe you want to turn your
I hope
camera
that's better.
off, because then that could, I mean, we all want to see you, but if you turn your camera off, that could consolidate your bandwidth a little bit, and we can maybe hear you better.
Any better?
Yeah, that sounded good. Let's
Okay,
try and
good.
Oh yeah, you sound great now.
This is the one of these research networks that I mentioned called the CoreNet. It's the National Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. And really, it's a goal. It's a network of networks that Marshfield Clinic is part of with dozens of sites around the country. University of Wisconsin was part of this for some time as well. But it's really designed to help do these larger pragmatic trials within healthcare systems. And so it's a lot of things like using the EHR to identify your eligible patients, recruiting large samples from multiple systems, and to gather as much of your data and your endpoints from the routine care that's already being delivered. Next slide, please. We're doing a number of these right now. Repower is one I was going to say a few words about that was recently completed. The adaptable trial is an aspirin study comparing 80 versus 325 dose of aspirin. That just finished up. And then right now we're in something called the preventable trial, which is looking at statin use and how it might prevent dementia. Next slide, please. So I'll very quickly say a few words about the Repower trial. So this just came out in JAMA, actually. This was a weight loss trial, a large cluster randomized trial in 36 practices in the rural part of the United States. So this was Kansas, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. And these were adult obese folks who lived in rural areas. Next slide, please. 36 clinics scattered here around the country assigned to one of these three arms. Next slide, please. I'll talk about those real quick. And so we were comparing different care delivery models for obesity treatment, behavioral obesity treatment, and primary care. The first one was a fee-for-service arm, which is really the CMS standard of one-on-one visits, weekly, fading to monthly over a period of 2 years. The next model was a group-oriented, kind of a patient-centered medical home approach where we brought people in groups. And the third arm was a disease management model where the coaching was delivered remotely. We enrolled 1,400 patients in this trial. If we go to the next slide, and we got pretty good retention on it. And then we'll skip right ahead to the next slide, which is really the punchline in this study. We compared those three arms. This is a pragmatic trial because you'll notice there's no control group. Also, the eligibility criteria were fairly broad. And then it was a mix of in-person research visits and some EHR data to arrive at some of these conclusions. But we looked at weight loss between those three conditions, and we indeed found that the patient-centered medical home, which is really the group approach where patients come to their own clinic in groups and receive their counseling, those folks actually lost the most weight over 2 years. Next slide, please. So just some quick conclusions in that study was, yep, you can do it. You can do weight loss in primary care in rural areas. All the models worked, so to speak, and that weight loss was achieved. The group patient-centered medical home approach was perhaps superior to the other groups over 24 months, however. So bottom line there, you need a big study. And in this case, we had to train up some of our clinic staff in order to deliver that intervention, which we were pleased to see that we were able to pull that off. In contrast, the adaptable trial and the preventable trials that I mentioned are much larger. These are actually, adaptable enrolled 15,000 patients, and preventable is trying to enroll 20,000. And so hundreds of sites from across the country, all coordinated using a common data model to ascertain outcomes. And so if we jump to my last slide, I'll kind of give a bottom line here before turning it over. But a couple of lessons that I've learned anyway with doing trials at MCRI, recognizing that while I've done some smaller, more traditional trials, most of my work of late has been in these larger pragmatic venues. But collaboration is key, much like it is anywhere else. But certainly in these larger trials, which can be done, you really need both the clinic and the institute, in my opinion, because as I showed in one of my first slides, a lot of your support is actually in the institute for large research studies. That's where your biostat folks are, your programmers are, and some of your perhaps more experienced scientists sit. But then you also need the clinic to answer clinical questions. And so we really need our service line directors, or in some cases, directly recruiting physicians in departments to pull things off. So that's, I think, the sweet spot in most of these larger trials anyway. Multimodal contact is important. Recruitment is always local, but it's got to come from staff or names that patients are familiar with. And it's not all done in the clinic. And at the flip side, it's not all done on a smartphone either. But there's a blend there that I think tends to work well right now. For some studies, good old-fashioned mail letters work pretty well. And in others, we do most of our recruitment all remotely, particularly in the COVID era. We've learned a lot about that lately. And then retention is of course, what you worry about in any trial, is to keep your patients in. But I think, having a plan and a strategy and a budget before you start is a big key, at least in some of these larger trials that can sometimes be overlooked when things happen fast. I will stop there. That's a little bit about what I know anyway about trials in Marshfield, and happy to
Thanks
chat.
very much, Jeff. Really appreciate your presentation. Everyone, if you have questions, please post in chat. It looks like there's one question. Go ahead, please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, this is Lauren Denlinger from the Department of Medicine. I'm the clinical vice chair for clinical and translational research. Just real impressed by the numbers and the outreach efforts to all the local sites and things like that. And you touched on this a little bit, but I wondered if you could elaborate on what approaches were used to help train the local staff for the purposes of recruitment, which sounds really robust.
It varies. I would say that it's kind of a hybrid, that meaning the recruitment is, I tend to gear towards centralized recruitment, meaning that we try to systematically identify, track, send letters, do phone calls from a centralized team. However, we try to do that in coordination with that local staff, because as you might imagine, oftentimes, like in the preventable trial, the first thing when someone gets a letter is they go to their doctor and they say, hey, what do you think of taking a statin to prevent dementia? And so we really need that buy-in from their provider or the staff that they're seeing in their clinic to back up some of the traditional methods we use to recruit, I would say. But doing that piece centrally, at least for tracking purposes, has a lot of advantages, in the sense that you kind of know who you're going after, who's eligible, and maybe more importantly, who's saying no, because then you can sort of adjust as you go to conduct your recruitment in more higher yield areas, if that makes any sense. In the repower trial, though, we actually trained the staff to deliver the intervention, which I hadn't done before. And so a lot of people were pretty new to weight loss counseling, which is, there's some specialized education and skills that we had to bring folks up on. But then we had to come up with a reimbursement model that looked like they were coming in for care, meaning that there still had to be reimbursement for the time spent on those activities. And so we worked closely with our supporting office to make sure that there was charge control, et cetera, that we were covering people's time, basically.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. Let's see if there's other questions. Thank you for your comments, Kyungmin. All right, let's move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Laurel Legenza. And Laurel is the Director of Global Health for the UW-Madison School of Pharmacy and is a TL1 postdoctoral fellow in ICTR. She's affiliated with the Sonderegger Research Center for Improved Medication Outcomes, and her TL1 postdoctoral research and training is examining ways to refine antimicrobial resistance visualizations and clinical decision support tools so that they are relevant to providers and align treatment decisions with local antimicrobial resistance patterns. An immensely important area of work. And thank you very much, Laurel. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Safdar, for that introduction. So the research that I'm presenting today is a collaboration, obviously, between the University of Wisconsin and Marshfield Clinic. And our research is supported by, and you can go to the next slide, an ICTR Pilot Award, as well as I'm supported by the School of Pharmacy and ICTR as a postdoctoral fellow. Next slide. My presentation today, I'm going to give you some background on the AMR tracker, or antimicrobial resistance tracker, and then describe my ongoing research with my postdoctoral research with the clinical decision support tool, as well as our ICTR Pilot Award research looking at geomapping antimicrobial resistance in E. coli from humans and animals. And finally, I'll conclude by discussing the necessary approvals and agreements to do this collaborative research. Next slide. So many of you are familiar with an antibiogram. An antibiogram shows the percent of bacteria tested at a lab in a health system that responded to the antibiotic. So here, zoomed in on E. coli, we have 74 under ciprofloxacin. That means 74% of the E. coli tested responded to the antibiotic, or 26% of those tested were resistant. And in my earlier research as a global health fellow, I looked at how frequently these antibiograms are used and how this data is translated into practice. And I found that there are some gaps in the use of this data in practice. I also asked a research question, next slide please, of how much would changing the presentation of AMR data with visualizations improve the translation of AMR resistance data into practice. And from the physicians that responded to the survey, there was strong support for a different way of visualizing this data. Next slide, please. So I was inspired by this weather map. On a sunny day like today, this is not the weather, but if it was today, we would know with very high probability that this thunderstorm is approaching Madison very quickly. So this is a percentage chance of rain that is shown. I looked at, could we show the percentage of antibiotic susceptibility in a similar way? Next slide, please. And we collected antibiograms at the system level from health systems across the state in collaboration with Eric Munson, based in Milwaukee. And we looked at those antibiograms and were able to map what the percent susceptibilities were for different antibiotics. And I collaborated with the state cartographer's office here in Madison within the Department of Geography to do these interpolations. So these are spline curves created from the actual data points from the antibiograms. And then we looked at, could we make this into a clinical decision support tool? Next slide, please. And we developed a prototype of what this tool might look like and published the prototype to, first of all, screen for the obvious risk factors for antibiotic resistance that may not be accounted for in our predictions, recent hospitalization, recent antibiotics. And with the tool, you can enter any location and the suspected pathogen of E. coli, and you will get a list of percent probability of an antibiotic being effective at that location, as well as you can see how the variation of antibiotic resistance varies across the state. Next roll, please. Next slide, please. So the current research that I'm doing as part of my ICTR postdoctoral program is to refine AMR visualizations in the AMR tracker clinical decision support prototype so that it's provider relevant and aligns treatment decisions with local AMR patterns. And in order to do this, I need to better understand the current workflow of providers and also test how this tool could be most useful. And perhaps it might look very different. Next slide, please. So in order to collect this information, I'm currently doing observations in Marshfield. I'm traveling to different Marshfield clinic sites, especially those rural sites where resources may be different, to observe how clinical providers are providing care, what type of patients they're seeing, how they're making treatment decisions, and what resources are available. I'm also conducting short interviews about how treatment decisions are made, and we'll be conducting some engagement sessions where we test different prototypes on how it might inform treatment decisions. So any providers from Marshfield on the call who are interested in learning more about this project, please do contact me, and my email is listed there along with my phone number. Next slide, please. Now to look more closely at the work we're doing with our ICTR Pilot Award, we're geomapping antimicrobial resistance in E. coli from humans and animals. And this research aims to determine the relationship between genetic patterns associated with antimicrobial resistance and geographic location in north central Wisconsin. So this is building on the larger AMR project. And what we're doing is we're looking at analyzing geographically genetic characterizations that were previously done from humans, canines, and bovines. Next slide, please. So in other words, we're looking at how E. coli from animals might be related to E. coli in humans. And you can advance. So is an AMR human infection more or less likely AMR in animals? And is this exposure maybe protective or detrimental? Advance. And again, we have data from canines, bovines, and humans. Next slide. So now the part about collaboration. The research that I described today is building on existing ongoing research. So we already had an IRB for the AMR tracker approved at UW-Madison. The genetic characterization of the E. coli isolates was also already approved at Marshfield. So after consultation with the IRB on next steps, we determined that it would be most appropriate to add addendums to both of those IRB protocols. Thus, the study and the work that I described today is approved by both the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute IRB and the UW-Madison Health Sciences IRB. We also have data use and transfer agreements. We're incorporating patient-level data into the AMR tracker study to provide a more easily accessible tool for accessing antibiotic susceptibility data. And in order to collect that data, we have the data use and transfer agreement. We also have a collaborative research agreement, and this also facilitates me traveling to the different clinic sites, observing care, as well as conducting those engagement studies. Next slide, please. So in summary, the AMR tracker provides a proof of concept, a highly interactive visual tool with novel visualizations of antibiotic susceptibilities. And we have an ongoing UW Marshfield Clinic collaboration. We are collecting higher precision data, and we're taking a One Health approach. So considering how antibiotic resistance might be related to antibiotic resistance in animals as well as humans. The AMR mapping project strives to ultimately transform empiric antibiotic treatment decisions with a novel clinical decision support tool. So what this means is the tool will be most useful at the point when laboratory results are not yet final or are not being conducted. Next slide. So thank you to the Marshfield Clinic Health System and the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute for their collaboration, support from ICTR and the University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy, Mentors and collaborators on this project include my co-PI for the pilot, Tom Sfurti, as well as collaboration with Dr. Matt Hall from Marshfield. Dr. Safdar is one of my postdoc mentors, as well as Michelle Chewy and John Lee from the University of Wisconsin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laurel. Everyone, go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we can call on you. We do have some time for questions. While people are thinking of one, Laurel, I might start by asking you, how do you envision this AMR tracker will get incorporated into the EMR perhaps? And there are obviously a whole other list of challenges and things that need to be navigated. So your thoughts about that would be helpful.
Certainly. So I like to think of a model for what this might look like as the Wisconsin Immunization Registry. The Wisconsin Immunization Registry is an aggregate at the state level of immunizations. And it's so valuable that many electronic medical records have customized a link to it directly within the medical record. And as the project progresses, this could be something that is able to plug into the medical record where it will directly feed in some of the risk factors like recent antibiotic use or recent hospitalization. But that will be a more advanced version of the model. I think in the next steps, it will be potentially a link that could be added to the medical record.
Terrific.
Thank you. That's a very common question that I get.
All right, other questions from people on the call? And we'll be doing questions at the end as well. So not seeing any other ones, and I'll monitor the chat as we go. Let me turn it over to our third speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Casper Bendixsen. Dr. Bendixsen is a social cultural anthropologist with an extensive background working with, living within, and researching agricultural and rural communities in the US. He is the director of the National Farm Medicine Center at Marshfield Clinic and is also the CTSA PI, site PI for Marshfield. His current work focuses on translating the knowledge of agricultural health and safety in order to promote voluntary adoption by farm and ranch communities, ultimately with the goal of reducing injuries, illness, and fatalities among farmers, farm workers, and farm families. Thank you very much, Casper. I recognize you're on vacation, and I'm very grateful that you are still able to present today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'll just double check right now. I am on a rural cellular signal, so can someone confirm that my sound is coming through clearly?
Sounds good right now.
Great. Yeah, happy to join. This is such a great topic of not only the idea of clinical trials and collaboration between our campuses, but I think in the broader context of just general rural health and the different elements that come into play with these kinds of studies. So what I'm going to do today, I have some of the same caveats as Dr. Jeff VanWormer, which is I am not a trialist by training, but I have found myself in the midst of a number of studies, which I think are representative of the collaborations and the potential research work that we can do across our campuses. In particular, when we think about the fact that the level of diversity in the greater part of Wisconsin probably does not add up to other CTSA locations. And so the one exception being rural health. So when we think about rural populations as an NIH defined community that needs more inclusive nature in terms of not only care, but that also means they need to be included in the research. And I think that that's the valuable point of many of our collaborations. And so I really appreciate the previous speakers and their reference to some of these studies, which no doubt had an impact on rural health in Wisconsin. So today I'm briefly going to go over 3 examples of projects that I'm involved with, and I hope they show the breadth and a little bit of the depth of the kinds of work that we can imagine between our colleagues, as well as kind of what things are heavy lifts versus what things are lighter lifts in terms of collaboration. So I'll begin with the Wisconsin Infant Study Cohort. This is a collaboration with Dr. Christine Ceruggi and Jim Gurn, and began with under the PI of Dr. Matt Kiefer, who was the former director of the Farm Medicine Center. And this is a really great example of something that starts fairly small, and then it has become a very large, robust project. In terms of concept, it was really looking at the natural laboratory of the farm environment and exploring the hygiene hypothesis, essentially, with prenatal conditions with farm moms and non-farm moms, many of the farm moms being in central Wisconsin and in dairy environments. And what does this environment mean for immune development? If you go back a slide, thank you. And how it impacts the immune system of children, and specifically those that are in the farm environment during pregnancy. And the early outcomes show us that exposure to not only during pregnancy, but also in early life, to a diversity of animals and livestock in their feedstuffs tend to put off any sort of beginning of the atopic march. So red rashes, atopic dermatitis, which eventually lead us to the chronic conditions of asthma. Now, this is a really interesting time to be doing these kinds of studies, really because the number of farms are dwindling, they're going down, and the number of farms where all family members are somehow involved are also going down. And then the number of farms with a diversity of livestock and animals is going down. We have a kind of a monocultural effect in large agriculture where we might have one breed of cow, which are all genetically very closely close together. They're very similar, as opposed to, say, an Amish or a plain community farm where you have a diversity of animals, including pets and turkeys and different types of species. This collaboration is really truly based in the central Wisconsin area. It was recruited through the Marshfield Clinic, and we have a number of research coordinators and different staff and program and programists here in Marshfield. But then a lot of our data, a lot of the samples get shared with University of Wisconsin. And then this study in particular has grown into large national consortiums where we know that our little group of farmers and rural families are included with populations from St. Louis and Boston and major metropolitan areas where we can learn more about what our environment does for our health. So next slide. This became particularly important during the epidemic when NIAID really pushed to enroll existing cohorts into COVID studies. So this kind of short, brief surveillance study where we were able to include farm families almost in a representative scale, meaning like 2% of the population, but talking about the exposure to family members and the spread of COVID-19 through a family unit. And being able to reconfigure this study so that it could be done remotely, especially in rural areas, sample pickups and things like that, was truly remarkable. The analysis is still underway, but I think the really important part was that any success that comes from a study like this, especially when it comes to representing a hard to reach population like rural folks, is because it pre-existed. We recruited the cohort and we utilized them and leveraged them towards a research question, but we left some of the benefits of having such a cohort and a unique one at that open, such that it could be agile and quickly adapt to something like a SARS-CoV surveillance study. Next slide. This is not a collaboration that I'm a part of, but this is one specifically between Dr. John Chusky, who's in UW Extension, and Dr. Brian Weichelt, who's in the Farm Center, where the farm cohort started with a small grant and has grown into NIH-funded arms and things like that. And it's been almost a decade now old. The farm fatalities report is something that was rejuvenated in the last couple of years, looking at the number of occupational related fatalities in ag across the country. Now, this is important because agriculture communities and their injuries related to occupation go under-surveyed. So there's no national report, so it takes a lot of digging, and it's built from not only newspaper clippings where a high-profile fatality would make the local paper, but also death reports from what was registered as an occupational related death. So this collaboration between clearly two groups that are interested in farmer health coming together on what is a method to characterize a problem. It's not a 100% accurate, meaning that we can only work with the data that we have, but it characterizes a high fatality rate in a dangerous occupation. So the report itself has been released. It describes the types of fatalities, the event that led to the farm fatalities, some of the locations and demographics and things like that. One of the things that right now is pending publication, but one of the things that was very poignant about one of these reports from 2017 and 2018 was nearly a quarter were a result of suicide. Now, that's probably not representative, but it is a striking number when you consider high-profile fatalities and the known stress in the dairy environment right now. We'll learn more in 2019 and 2020 what that looks like as well. So if nothing else, it tells us we should be paying attention. And this is generated with a fairly lean team, and it can be rejuvenated every year. But we look forward to having things like this that produce a small report that help us lead in directions to better research questions. One, about here, in this case, occupational fatality, but then two, what do the fatalities say about the healthcare needs of the community we're looking at? And so this is a striking story, perhaps, about mental health and suicide in the farm community. And May being Mental Health Month, I thought this was a very important kind of note to make on one of our collaborations. Next slide. And of course, the one that we're most familiar with is ECTR, the CTSA. And I think that this is particularly important when we talk about directions for the CTSA and directions for a collaboration between our campuses, particularly because the translational work of health and medicine, one, taking many, many years to move from the bench to the patient is a problem that clearly the ICTR is meant to resolve. But then two, the inclusion of populations in the research at the beginning so that they're influencing the research questions, they're involved with the research recruitment and sampling, and then ultimately we want to see them involved with whatever intervention or prevention or health promotion activity comes out of that research. And when we talk about rural health, we're talking about a very hard to reach community with its own social cultural characteristics. Not to make a monolith out of the rural community. There is diversity in the rural community, but there are some things that are commonalities that build characters of a certain type. The lack of internet, the distance between me and a provider, whether or not the provider looks like someone I know or trust or is from my community, has an accent. These are things that need to be dealt with in a very real way. And so when I think about translational research, I always think about what UW and MCRI, and of course the Farm Center has a small piece of this, what can we do for rural communities in a way to improve their health? And I think that involves not only things like clinical trials, although clinical trials would be a great benefit, I think, to master the art of rural recruitment, but also the social cultural studies that I conduct, the intervention studies, and then moving forward into what our dissemination models look like, I think is really the big question for a lot of folks. How do we make sure that the research that we know can be translated one more time or improved and then implemented so that everyone benefits? I think that's clearly a goal for any healthcare researcher in the greater part of Wisconsin anyway. I'll stop there. I do want to leave adequate time for questions for my presentation as well as the other speakers. I really appreciate you having me today, and I hope that the cell signal didn't chop up too much, and if it did, I hope it chopped up the parts that I flubbed up.
Thanks very much, Casper. No, your signal was perfect, and really appreciative of all our speakers' time and generosity today. We have one question that Noah, I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask.
Yeah, this was about the heat maps for antibiotic resistance. And I was wondering if you see this being extended to like a nationwide thing. Going through like the CDC data on some of this stuff can be really irritating, and having a heat map like this is really visually pleasing and intuitive to read. So I think it would be like very helpful to have it even on a nationwide scale, kind of like the COVID heat maps from Johns Hopkins.
Noah, that's a great comment, and certainly part of my career goals is that this project could continue to grow with extramural funding. And I think what's different about what we're doing with the AMR tracker is we're collecting all of the data from health systems to be able to make those susceptibility predictions, while the CDC data is often only those that are reportable to the CDC. So it's a different mix of isolates that are reported. Thank you, Noah.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Laurel. Other questions? We wanted to make sure we left plenty of time for those. While people are thinking about this, Jeff, I have a question for you. So one of the challenges with doing research in the health system, as you know, is that the health system has its own strategic priorities and the need to get work done in a certain timely manner. So introducing a research project can sometimes pose a conflict to that. And I wondered how you've navigated that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It can be difficult. I think usually you're trying to find the alignment though, and and so it sometimes means you're talking to different people, for lack of a better way to say it, until you get some support, get the answer that you want. The adaptable trial I mentioned is a good example, perhaps, where the truth be told, when we started adaptable, we didn't have a whole lot of support in Marshfield cardiology for it. They supported the general idea, but had some qualms about getting involved in a hands-off recruiting large pragmatic trial. And so we ended up doing most of the clinical partnerships in that trial, at least to start, through our general internal medicine folks. It was just a little bit better fit, perhaps, with aspirin being an over-the-counter, et cetera. And so it was really later on when we started to get more involvement from cardiology, helping us with recruitment, et cetera, after we had some success in it. So sometimes it takes a bit of a sideways approach, but you're right that there's always going to be, when you're one person or one group that supports it, maybe felt like it's out of alignment with another group's initiatives or priorities.
Sounds great. Thanks very much. Lauren, you have a question?
Sure. First, a thank you to all three of the speakers. These were really great talks. So I noticed in the last one, there was a photo of the micro device on the participant's arm, which is called a Tasso device. And I know a little bit about it in that it's a micro sampling device for blood biomarkers. I was just curious if you can comment on the experience and how participants handle it and the quality of the data that you're getting from it.
Yeah, no, the Tasso device is really, it's kind of an interesting path forward especially when we talk about research in the midst of a pandemic, but also in terms of remote and maybe research participants who can't travel that well. And so that basically it's a micro blood collection device that attaches to the flat of the body in more or less terms, and is I think when they were doing the pain scale, it was like a 2. Really remarkable method of getting a blood sample. It was our first time using it, and I would say that the outcomes are going to be very important for the maker of the device. Simply put, those who learned how to use it said they would use it again. Those that had trouble with particularly the level of safety mechanism on it became frustrating for some of the participants and their parents. Simply that they would try and retry, and the safety features on there would kind of shut the device off, and it was a battle for some of those folks. But I do think it's worth exploring further in terms of how we get our bio samples, especially when we talk about physical distance and things like that. Some of the outcome data is going to be a little bit difficult to interpret simply based on when people come and go out of the study. One thing I will say though is that particularly for this device, the there was an advantage to using a new device simply because this was a cohort that had been collecting samples of one kind or another for 7 years. And so, they were not shy about the idea of collecting nasal, and they've had blood taken in the clinic setting. And so much like a clinical trials participant, a environmental study like this, the participants get good at it. And so I think it's a little bit easier to ask them to try something new. So there's probably a slight advantage there.
Thank you, Casper. One thing that comes to mind is you shared some very wrenching data on suicides in the farm population. The VA health system has really made suicide prevention a big priority, and I wonder, are there collaborations that are being discussed or underway between the Farm Medicine Center and veterans?
So on particularly the topic of veterans is important because there's a lot of overlap between rural and ag and veteran population. I think there was 2008 data, if I recall, where basically half of Army recruits reported coming from a rural town, a rural place. And so there's a large overrepresentation of rural people in the military in general. And so if they return home, they return to their rural environment, they become not only at risk for all the things that happen in rural places and all the troubles they have there, but also the military. My dad is a Vietnam veteran, for example, and a farmer. And so when we talk about veteran farmers too, we're sometimes doubling down on things like isolation and stress, but also kind of trying some new things like animal husbandry and cultivating food could be therapeutic, more or less. But when we talk about mental health and suicide, I think we're talking about some of the similar things like stoicism, stigma, some of the kind of upfront battles that we have with even talking about it. What we learn about one population might very well be applicable to another. The other piece of this is learning who farmers or veterans trust more than other folks, and allowing them to be kind of informed and trained, like in QPR training and things like that, so that we don't have to rely on primary care or mental health professionals or that person's access to them. There are collaborations for the farm and rural environment. I'm currently not aware of any ones that are specific to military, other than ones that are for military farmers.
Terrific, thank you. All right, let's see, last call for questions. And while people are thinking, maybe I'll pose one for you, Laurel, which is that, when we're doing studies in busy clinic settings, we try to be very aware of the time that we take from people and the fact that we can impose upon their workflow. And you seem to have had some success in your interviews with providers. So I wonder if you can share what are some good things to think about when you are needing to get some research data from busy clinicians.
Certainly. So the approach that I've taken is always to be super flexible. So I let the provider tell me what time works best for them for an interview, and that could be any time of the day. I also try to be that fly on the wall when I am the observer and try to not impose on their time. And other things that I do is just be grateful, because I agree it's a busy time and I'm taking some of their time sometimes.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Laurel.
If I may add one tangent to that question, one of our scientists in our center has had some success with what gets sometimes tough with clinicians and physicians is you really can't incentivize the same way for interviews and surveys the same. But one method we used was instead of incentive for the individual, we would make a donation in their name to a local charity. And so that was a little bit bent on the altruism of the physician, but also kind of placed more value on the dollars available for incentives because they were going to go to someplace like a charity.
Great, thank you, very helpful. All right, just sharing that the next meeting will be Thursday, August 19th from 12 to 1. We'll record all future sessions as well. Thank you again to our speakers for their generosity and the gift of their time. And thank you all for attending the Clinical Trials Community of Practice.
Thank you for your questions, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.